Hello everyone, I'm Pooja Ranjan, the Herder-in-Chief from Ethereum Cat Herders, and I welcome you all to the first episode of the EIP Focus Series PEEP and EIP. Just to give you a little background based on my engagement with the network upgrade and protocol improvement process since joining the Cat Herder group, I sensed a gap of education required to understand and accept the Ethereum improvement protocols. This was the motivation behind my proposal of a video series dedicated to discussing Ethereum protocols. Core protocols are somewhat discussed in the All Core Day meeting. Maybe that is helpful to an extent to understand the technical specification, but I strongly believe that an ELI 5 version could be helpful for community understanding and adoption. Similarly, there are hundreds of non-core EIPs resting in draft status. They could use some visibility through this series where EIP will be explained by the author itself. Today we have Matt Garnett. Many of you may have known him as Light Client to talk about the basics of creating an EIP. We also have on the call Greg Colvin, an experienced EIP editor, William Shaw from our talented Cat Herders group. So without further ado, let me pass the microphone to Matt to get started.
Thanks a lot, Pooja. I think this series is an awesome thing that you guys are doing with the Cat Herders. I definitely empathize with the need to bring this process to more people in the community. I think it's a really important process, and so I'm pretty humbled to talk about it with everybody today. So hopefully by the end of this, you guys who are watching will understand a little bit more about what it takes to write an EIP and what the process that an EIP goes through to get it in some sort of finalized state, and how that differs from the process that it takes to get it included into a network upgrade. So what I'm going to cover is everything that includes the definition of EIPs, timeline for EIPs, and people are participating, the structure. We'll go through some examples of good ideas for EIPs and things that may not be as good ideas, and then some common mistakes that people make, that I've seen that people make when they write an EIP. And we'll wrap it up with some Q&A of this and other things that are on the EIP process. So with that said, let's define an EIP. I think of it as a concise and thorough document. I generally think it's a technical document in nature. The standard track type of EIP is one of the types of EIPs that's most prevalent, and these are technical documents that refer to some sort of specification. The most common one that people might, the one that most people might be most familiar with, the type of standard track EIP that usually is most advised to the community are the core category of EIPs. And these are things that actually change the consensus of the Ethereum protocol. And so these sorts of EIPs are the ones that are very prevalent in those sorts of discussions. The most popular category of EIP is the ERC type of standard track EIP, and this usually defines interfaces for smart contracts on the Ethereum network, and this helps define standards that let people interoperate with smart contracts. And the ERC20 token is a great example of this type of EIP. It defines a token interface that different types of smart contracts can utilize, and so things that kind of live within this ERC category. The interface and networking types of EIPs are important EIPs for the client, but they aren't necessarily things that necessitate network upgrades. It's really the consensus related changes in the core category that need to be included in some sort of network upgrade. The other two less popular types of EIPs are the meta EIP and the informational EIP. And I think the informational EIPs are criminally underutilized in the process. I think there's maybe 4 to date. And I think there's a lot of information in the community that it would be better served as part of this EIPs repository. And so going forward, I'd really like to see more of these informational EIPs where you share knowledge that's beneficial to the community as a whole. And I'll talk about some examples that I think that might fit really well within that category or that type later. So the process of the EIP generally starts with an idea. And if you're already familiar with kind of what the process for the EIP is, you might notice that these aren't exact one-to-one correlation with what is listed in the EIP 1, which kind of specifies how this process works. And the main two reasons for that is it's likely that the actual names of these stages are going to change in the future with some work from the Ethereum Cat Herders. But also, I think that the general process will always stay the same. And this is, very high level what happens whenever you come up with an idea for an EIP and you move it all the way to some sort of finalized state. And it really starts like with this idea where you think that you have something that you want to do to the Ethereum network, whether it's upgrade the protocol in some way that will make it better, provide more utility for the community, or you want to propose some sort of standard that the community can utilize that should be interoperable with contracts. And this is a stage that's often overlooked. I think it's really important because it can save you and the people in this process time if you just talk to some people about your idea and try and understand if it's been proposed before, and if something related to it has been proposed before, what the feedback on that was, and try and use that to vet your idea some more and decide if you want to move to the next stages. If you do that and you're happy with your idea and you think that there's a need and the desire for the community to have this idea, then you can move on and actually write a specification. And in this draft format, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to embody the idea enough of a way that it's a good reference point for people to get feedback on. And that's going to let you move to this next stage of iteration. Once you have your draft in that format, then you would want to submit a pull request to the EIPs repository, and the editors will take a look at it and make sure that it meets the criteria for being a draft EIP. And the criteria is all listed in the EIP 1, but it's generally is it syntactically correct? Is the information that needs to be there included in the EIP, and these sorts of things. And they might give some technical feedback on it. But at that point, they'll merge it into the EIPs repository, and it's time to start to really iterate on this idea and to share it with the community and try and get feedback so that you can move it on to implementation and testing. And the implementation and testing and iteration phases will probably go somewhat hand in hand, because as you're implementing and testing, you'll find things that may need to change within the specification. And so you can work through this process yourself and with the community as they're learning about this EIP and reviewing it. Once you get this EIP into a place where it's implemented and tested, it's generally time to move it to motion for it to go into some sort of last call stage. And this is kind of the stage where you want the broader community to take a look at this EIP. You're happy with its progress, and you don't think that it's going to substantially change in the future. And so you want to make sure that it has a lot of eyes on it before it's moved to some sort of final state that it can't be removed from. And so if your EIP goes into this last call stage and doesn't receive any substantial requests for changes over the 2-week or so period, then you can motion for it to become final. And it's important to note that this final state is really just a statement of the EIP itself. It's not a statement of will it be included in an upcoming network upgrade or anything. It's really just saying that this EIP has been looked at by people from the community. The author or the champions of this EIP don't see any substantial changes coming to this EIP in the future. And so it's in this finalized state, but that does not mean that it will eventually be included into a network upgrade. That's a completely separate process from just the EIP specification process. So during the process, I'm sure you noticed there's a lot of different participants, and I just wanted to quickly talk about the different roles that people play and generally what the importance of their roles and what they do. And the obvious, starting role is the author or authors of the EIP, and these are the people who kind of have this idea and write this initial draft. And it's possible that the person who authors this EIP is either unwilling or unable to be its champion, which is generally referred to as some sort of manager for the EIP, the person who really drives it to reach some sort of final state, and also maybe carries it on to try and make it into some sort of network upgrade. It can be the author, and it is the author in a lot of occasions, but sometimes there's a need for champions other than the author to be the sort of project manager and really make sure that people are implementing the EIP and that it's getting tested and socializing it across the community to make sure that the feedback that needs to be given is given. Then we have the editors who, are probably the most formally defined role in the process. The editors are listed in EIP 1, and their role is generally to facilitate the EIP process and to make sure that the EIPs that are properly following the process and that they're syntactically correct and they are filling out the correct structure of the EIPs. And sometimes they give technical advice to EIPs, so they try and help people determine if their EIP is really actually a good idea to be an EIP, or if it doesn't necessarily need to be one. I think that a lot of people put too much pressure on editors to give technical feedback, and I think that it's not necessarily the editor's job. I think it's the community's job as a whole to really help provide technical feedback. So it's not reasonable to think that editors are going to be an expert of every aspect of the Ethereum protocol. And I think a good example is if there's some sort of EIP for modifying the RPC for Ethereum clients. If you're a developer who regularly uses that, you're in a good position to give feedback and to try and comment on that sort of EIP and say why you don't think that's a good thing. And that helps alleviate some of the editor's job for giving the technical feedback. And then the last important role, the last participant is the core developers. These are the people who are maintaining clients and have a really good understanding of what's feasible and what's not feasible with the core protocol. And so although their time is incredibly limited, if you can get them involved in an EIP and get some feedback from them early on, it can help save a lot of time, and you can understand, from their experience what may or may not be possible. I don't want to go into too much depth on every single portion of an EIP, but just so that people understand, this is the general template that a standards track EIP would follow. And this is very much geared towards a code heavy EIP. We have things like test cases and implementation and stuff. And so maybe the informational or meta type of EIPs wouldn't have this sorts of thing. But for the standards track EIP, you would want to follow this sort of structure. And everything here is defined in depth in EIP 1, and it explains exactly what you need to do for each of these. And we'll touch on a little bit more about some mistakes that I think people make whenever they're trying to follow this structure later. But this is generally what an EIP needs to have for it to be considered as some sort of draft EIP and to be accepted into the repository. So now I just want to go through just a few examples of things that might make a good EIP or some things that may not be as EIPable. And the first example is an EIP that could introduce an opcode which returns the sender's nonce. This is definitely a standards track core EIP because it's modifying the EVM. This is something that you would want to do a network upgrade to achieve. It's up for debate if this is an opcode that's valuable to the community and is really providing utility to the protocol. It's something that would be determined through the EIP process. But as a draft, as an idea, this is definitely along the right path. Another example is something that would reduce gas costs of call data. This is something that's been done in the past and is obviously a good example of when you want to do an EIP. If you think that something is overpriced in the Ethereum gas schedule and you can explain and give some rationale why you think it is, then this is obviously a good example of something that you would want to write an EIP for. Something that you wouldn't want to write an EIP for is something that is inherently single use or something that doesn't need to be interoperable across the network. And if you have some gaming contract that you've written for your dApp, it obviously has an interface that your dApp is using, but unless a lot of other contracts on the network need to interoperate with your gaming contract, or more of your gaming contracts will be deployed with the same interface, it's really unlikely that you need to standardize this. This is something that you would want to standardize for your own purposes, but it doesn't provide utility to the community as a whole. Another bad example of an EIP is I think that a lot of people want to add EIPs that add a lot of complexity to the core protocol, whenever it's important that we try and keep that as simple as we can. And you know, there could be an EIP that adds an opcode to transfer like an ERC20 token. And I see that as mixing the higher level gap level of the protocol with the core level of the protocol. And maybe there could be a valid discussion that could be had here to explain why you think that having native creatable assets to the core protocol is valid. But generally, we try to avoid adding undue complexity to the core protocol that can be implemented at higher levels. Those are things that we want to try to avoid having as an EIP. As an informational EIP, I think that explaining some of the gotchas about client development would be really valuable. And I think the Go Ethereum team does a great job on their pull requests. And they've recently written a blog post about this exact topic, about how to efficiently represent the state database on disk. And I think that these sorts of things would be very valuable to write in EIP format and save for posterity for the future and for future client developers to understand and see. So I think this is a really good example of an informational type of EIP because it provides utility to the community and the protocol as a whole. The last example I have that I don't think is a good example of an EIP is if you've released some sort of DAO and you want to give an update to the community on the status of your DAO. I don't think that's a good example of an EIP. Even if your DAO is completely decentralized and open to anyone, it's unlikely that the community as a whole is interested in your specific DAO, and so it's not providing utility to the community as a whole to provide information about the specific DAO, give updates. You would want to do that through whatever channels you've built with your community, whether that's like Twitter or a blog or something. The EIPs repository is not a great place for that to occur. So some common mistakes that I've seen while I've been looking through EIPs in the past, I think that the number one mistake is just people don't read EIP 1. EIP 1 is kind of your manual for writing an EIP. It defines everything very clearly. It defines how to write your EIP, like what should be in each section, what the process, what the stages are. And you know, a lot of the stuff that pretty much everything that I've talked about in this presentation is written explicitly in EIP 1. And so it's important that if you're going to write an EIP, to go through this, you can read it several times and understand what needs to be done to get it to a certain state. That's going to alleviate a lot of back and forth that's going to need to happen between you and editors who are required to make sure that EIPs conform to that standard that's specified. I also see a lot of spelling and grammatical errors, and we have tools in the repository to help alleviate this sorts of stuff. But I think that these errors just come from not respecting the process as much. I think it's too easy to write an EIP, and because of how easy it is and because of the lack of respect for the process, people just write out something and not give it a second look. Whenever this is a really important process for the very important decentralized network. And so I think the spelling and grammatical errors can easily be alleviated if we just respect the process more, and people take the time to actually go through it and double check their work before submitting it. I also see people avoiding community feedback. This is something that's critical to have from the idea stage all the way to the last call. You can't write an EIP in your own box. You need to receive feedback and iterate on it. So it's really unlikely that you're going to know everything that needs to be done. It's unlikely that your point of view is the point of view held by everyone in the community. So getting the feedback is critical. I see a lot of people mixing the motivation section of the EIP into the abstract, and I think it's important that the abstract focuses on just the technical change that the EIP proposes, rather than being more sensational. Both sections are really important, and the motivation section is extremely important to show why an EIP should exist, but there's a specific section for it. I don't think that the abstract is necessarily where a lot of that should live. like the gaming contract, I see a lot of EIPs that are focused on these single use cases. I don't know if it's people just want to write an EIP to write an EIP, or they want some sort of prestige associated with an EIP number. But writing a EIP for a single use case that's not going to provide utility and interoperability for the community is not useful. And the last common mistake that I see a lot is people who just abandon work. I think there's been some pretty high profile EIPs where the author has written some sort of sensational EIP, they've drafted it, and they've never kind of come back to actually merge it in and take the feedback that the editors have given them and integrate that into their work. They just, for some reason or another, never come back to their draft, and so it just sits there as a pull request for a long time. So I think that if we can just avoid some of these, I think the process as a whole would, improve a lot. So if you want to get involved, the place where pretty much all happening is on GitHub at the EIPs repo under the Ethereum organization. This is where you can see the raw version of all of the EIPs in their markdown format, and you can submit your pull request to include your own EIPs. There's also a discussion forum, ethmagicians.org. So if you're interested in following the discussions around EIPs, this is generally where those take place. If you're interested in following discussion for a specific EIP, I would recommend taking a look at that EIP and then seeing where its discussion to is pointed to. Most of the time it's an Ethereum Magicians thread, but sometimes it could be a GitHub issue or something else. So that's all I had for the presentation. I'm really excited to see more people get involved with the EIP process. I think it's an incredibly important process in the Ethereum community. And so the more people that we have involved, and I think the higher the quality the EIPs will be, and therefore the higher the quality our protocol is going to be. So with that, is there any questions we have?
Okay, maybe first I might try opening up the floor to Greg, just in case do you have any comments that you'd like to add? You're still muted, Greg.
Okay, a lot of background noise here. Yeah, I just really appreciate the presentation, so thank you very much for that. Not a whole lot to add there. A lot of people start up an EIP as an issue on the repository. Partly that grabs you a number before you're ready to actually do a PR. And sometimes PRs are a pain if you don't know how to use JIT. So you sometimes want to put that off a little so an editor can help you with that stage. I think the meaning of final, maybe that's in flux, but we editors from way back only intended that for core EIPs to mean that it actually got deployed. What's final about it is once it's running on the network, it can't be changed except to correct it to reflect what's actually running on the network. So that's what's final about it. And I guess that's still under discussion some, but whatever we call it, that's a very important, what's the word? It's an important landmark once it's on the network. So those are the only little things I noticed go by.
I know there's been a bit of a question, which I might hand over to Pooja, about interacting with the bot. As in, there is a bot, as far as I'm aware, that is active in the EIP repo that checks the EIPs are properly formatted. What people who are having difficulty trying to figure out what the bot wants from them, or Pooja, if you could elaborate on the question at all, maybe you'd be able to talk a little bit about what people can do about that.
Right. So when we submit a pull request in the EIP GitHub repo, sometimes we see a green check, sometimes it is a red mark that is easily visible. So my understanding is that's because of validated bot. So I would love to hear more about how people can get past the bot. I remember encountering such issue myself. For an example, like when we submit a pull request, the EIP one suggests that we should not be entering the EIP number. It's a job of editor. But if we do it without that, sometimes we feel the red mark. I mean, we see the red mark. So how should we proceed towards submission and see that we are able to pass the bot checks?
That's a pain. Nick Johnson, I think, wrote the bot, and then he sort of disappeared on paternity leave. And I'm not sure if he's coming back or not. We haven't heard from him much. Someone took on some maintenance of it, and I can't remember who. So we need whoever that person is. I don't know how much they're sticking to it, but we need someone to take on maintenance of that bit of code. And probably we need a bit of documentation about what does this thing expect of you. But if you follow the little links into the details, the error messages will usually try to tell you what you did wrong.
All right. Thank you. Another question is related to these kind of stuff only. When we talk about informational and meta EIP, as explained in one of the earlier slides about the parameters that we should consider, I think security consideration and test cases may not be valid for those kind of EIPs. So when we create informational or meta EIP, if we remove these sections, do you think it is the right one, or do we have different template for different EIPs?
Oh, I think once you get out of the technical leaps into those, all bets are off. And even in the more technical ones, you can violate the structure if there's a reason to. And then the editors will argue about it a little bit. And from my point of view, if the thing makes sense and you can implement it, I'm not too worried. And if it's just information, present it as is appropriate for the information.
Matt, maybe if I could comment on a little bit of the presentation. You mentioned problems with spelling and grammar occasionally. I definitely am no expert on the IP repository itself, but I'm wondering, is some of that possibly just a language barrier? And I mean, to make that into a more practical question, someone who does not speak English as a first language and may have limited faculty in English, how do you think they should be going about trying to get EIP drawn up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I definitely think that part of it is that the EIPs repository is mainly an English repository. I think all an English repository. And so people who don't speak English as their first language, it's hard for them to construct really good, grammatically correct EIPs. I don't know if I have a good solution for, this sorts of things. I would be curious to know how other standards organizations work, if they, primarily say that our standards are written in English, and to be written, to write a standard, you have to be competent in English. I think that this is a role that editors can help in, or that champions can help in, and finding people who do speak the language of the EIPs repository currently. If it's my point of view is that if it's an important EIP, even if you don't speak English, we can find people who will care about this EIP and can champion it and, get it to a place where it is grammatically correct. And it's, very readable for people who are implementing it.
I hear that. It made me think also that it would seem to me that there's really an importance in trying to build up a bit of a community around an EIP, which is something that I think we've been seeing a bit more of. I mean, it would prevent author champion burnout to a certain degree. It would probably also ensure a certain amount of resource into making sure that the EIP can actually clear the various hurdles that it needs to clear. Do you have any particular thoughts about community building around EIPs?
Yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot because, you know, a lot of my frustrations and the things that I see that are, you know, not going as well for the EIPs repositories I think they could be is exactly what you said. It's, to me, due to a lack of community. And I feel like there's, you know, a lack of ownership and a lack of accountability that exists there. And one potential solution that I've been thinking about and I'm trying to figure out how to implement in a lightweight way is some concept of a working group or working groups, because pretty much every standards organization in the world has working groups who help, you know, manage like specific niches within the standards. And so I think that if we had some working groups who kind of own the concept of the EVM, or working groups who own the, you know, interface layer of Ethereum, they're going to be able to help inbound EIPs and give feedback to them, and they're going to be able to set goals for their group and to set like, you know, have general ideas of EIPs that they want to author, or they want to help find people, or you know, navigate incoming resources to work on. So to me, if we can find some way of developing some sort of working group system, that I think that would help alleviate a lot of the issues that exist.
There's a notion of working groups called rings in the Magicians, and I think that's been badly underutilized.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, you know, part of the reason is that there isn't a strong level of accountability between the EIPs repository and rings. And I don't know why there's not, I don't know why the rings aren't identified and leaders aren't identified of rings, or, you know, champions or curators, those rings aren't identified in the EIPs repository to give ownership and accountability.
I'm not sure either. It takes volunteers.
Sure.
Another question I may have for you, Matt, related to the good example and bad example of EIPs that were shown in one of these slides today. So when we say that if an EIP is only specific to a single use case, just for example, the game use case that you have mentioned, so those are not good example of EIPs. So when we say that, what does that mean? Those EIPs are rejected, and if they are, like, how do we do that? What is the process for this kind of, you know, selection and rejection? I mean, I get to know about this presentation, with this presentation, that these are good and bad, but in general, are there any guidelines for people to follow?
I think EIP 1 will pretty clearly lay out the things that might be EIPable. And if there's some gray area, I think generally, you know, when there's gray area people and editors, and Greg can jump in and, you know, share his opinion, but I think that some gray area that people are pretty willing to hear why you might think it's EIPable. And, you know, if it's pretty cut and dry, it's a very specific use case, it's not adding utility, I think that editors typically just don't merge it as a draft. Is that what usually happens, Greg?
Editors vary, and we'll talk some, but generally we actually don't want to question the content all that much. We don't. We've gotten in some bad political situations before, and so we're more inclined to just merge it if it meets the formal requirements and leave it to the rest of the process. Most of those will die on the vine. And at least I'm not that concerned about using up integers in the draft numbering system.
EIP Overflow.
There are a lot of integers to give.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I think we discussed that, and Maka and I said, okay, we can just close them. And if the author shows up again, they could reopen them, but that gets them sort of out of the way.
Okay, I think that might be it for Q&A. What do you say, Pooja?
Yeah, I think this is like quite informational session, and that's all questions that we have received. And we are almost about time. So if anyone has anything to just conclude.
I just want to thank Greg for his time he spent over the years working in the EIPs repository and being an editor. I think it's a thankless job in general. So I appreciate,
everything I've done for Ethereum has been both thankless and highly rewarding.
We really thank you. We thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you both here. And I hope all these tips and tricks shared by Matt and you and discussed in this episode will come handy to any of the user while creating a clear and precise Ethereum improvement protocol next time. So I hope to see you soon with another episode of series PEEPanEIP. Thank you for being with us today. Stay tuned, subscribe to Ethereum Cat Herders, and thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Making this happen, Pooja.